call Carol Beaumont.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I rise again to speak of another example of a concerted attack on wage and salary earners in this country. And I just would note for the record and for those that are listening that all the way through both this piece of legislation and the employment relations legislation, we've had members opposite standing up and saying, I'm just going to take a short call on this, and actually not dealing with what are actually very substantial issues and major changes to our legislation. So I think that in itself is quite telling. There's been no real content, no real decision to analyse the issues, but just to put out the same platitudes about how this is really about choice and being dressed up as choice. And I'm going to talk about some of the choices, especially in light of the comments made by Roger Douglas. And also, supposedly, this particular bill is about making it easier to understand. Well, I think that's an interesting one as well, so I'll talk about that. But look, like the Employment Relations Amendment, this bill is unjustified, it is unnecessary, it's unbalanced and unfair, and I'm going to talk about three key provisions and analyse them against those particular points. But at its heart, we are dealing with a set of issues that are about time, about people's time and about their work-life balance and the ability to manage their time at work and their time outside of work. And that's an increasingly significant issue in countries like New Zealand. We have gone from a situation where one-income households were the norm to, in fact, necessary for households to have both parents working. Often the kids are working as well. Most teenage children, the majority of them, are in the paid workforce as well. So we've gone into a situation where time is an increasingly hard issue for many families to balance. Now, there's been a temporary situation, I hope at least, temporary situation where unemployment has meant that some people have far too much time, and that's a separate issue and one that this government is not addressing properly either. But I'm talking about those that are in the paid workforce here. And that ability to manage work and other life issues is really important, and it goes to both the quality of working life and also the quality of our wider lifestyle, the sort of issues around spending time with family and friends and enjoying some of the things that we think make us uniquely New Zealand, being able to go out into the bush, to the beach, some of those sorts of things. Now, when you read the regulatory impact statement, you see major concerns raised about a number of provisions here, and again the whole situation being raised by officials that there is not the evidence to back up many of the provisions that have been put forward here. And I won't litigate that again because I know that the Honourable Trevor Mallard has explained that in some detail to the House, but that doesn't seem to matter to members opposite. Getting advice from officials and ignoring it seems to be a relatively common occurrence, but I do put that on record that many concerns have been raised in the regulatory impact statement. So I'm going to talk about the fourth week first, and this is a minimum provision, and minimum provisions are by their nature meant to say that these are standards. We say as a standard that the minimum wage is set by law, and you can't work for less than the minimum wage because as a country we believe that that is a socially acceptable minimum. Likewise, well, I'm sure they may well have a go at the minimum wage next actually, but likewise minimum holiday provisions are that. They are minimum holiday provisions, time to have off on pay with family and friends and enjoy some time together that isn't at work. They are minimum provisions. That's what the 4 weeks annual leave is. It is time to have a holiday. It's not time to sell a holiday, it's time to have a holiday. And as I said in earlier speeches on this bill, that very few people get to the end of their life and regret that they didn't spend more time at work. They often get to the end of their life and regret that they didn't spend more time with their family or doing the things that mattered to them. So, well, yes, and I have flagged up, and I just will reinforce that again, that there is a huge issue with unemployment which this government is not addressing. This fourth week, and the sale of the fourth week, is linked at its heart to low wages. The desire to sell the fourth week will be driven by low wages. And the examples that Roger Douglas gave were about people who need money. So the people most likely to have to sell their holidays are those on low incomes. And our wages are too low. There is a gap of 30% on average between wages in New Zealand and wages in Australia, and that gap is getting larger and will continue to get larger under this government that does not have any ideas on lifting workplace productivity, on improving the quality of our working lives. That gap between wages in Australia will get higher. It is the reason why people leave our country and go to Australia, and it will drive people selling their fourth week of leave. Not because they don't want to spend time with their family and have time off, but because they have to sell it to get some money. Now, there will be groups that are most likely, low income and other vulnerable groups will be the ones that are most likely to be in the situation of losing that fourth week that is actually a reasonably new addition to our minimum code. So young workers, people who don't know their right, maybe people who English is a second language, maybe those that perhaps are disabled. A whole lot of vulnerable workers are most likely to be in this situation. And of course, to try and tell everybody that the government wasn't going to see that happen, we had provisions in the original bill that said that the sale of the fourth week would be informed and voluntary. Well, of course, those provisions got taken out. The informed and voluntary bit is no longer in there. So I say that it is linked to low wages and that vulnerable workers and low-income people will be the people who lose their holidays, not the sort of people that perhaps members opposite are most concerned about. Now, there's been a lot by ACT. Heather Roy last week talked about it, and today Roger Douglas talked about it as if this is kind of like a property right, and it's just, Labor and the Greens are stopping people doing something that they want to do, as if, in fact, that's what this bill provided for. And I would like Roger Douglas to get up in this House and say that he would like to see this take away the rights of the employer in this situation, because he clearly hasn't read the bill. This is not a free right to sell your holiday, because ultimately, actually, it's up to the employer. The employer can have a completely blanket policy that says nobody here will be allowed to sell their leave. Not anybody, no matter how desperately they need the money, as Sir Roger said. So if they're worried about the property rights, they perhaps need to talk to National about the fact that the balance is clearly and firmly in the side of the employer. So certainly unjustified, unnecessary, definitely unbalanced and potentially unfair. This will be something that applies to only some New Zealanders, and some New Zealanders will have less of an opportunity to take time off with their family and friends. Now, the second one I want to talk about, and one I feel hugely strongly about, is the alternative holiday provision, the day in lieu. This is a shocking situation where there's no evidence of any need for change. Department of Labour were quite clear on that, and submitters as well. And yet we are seeing a situation where what is working perfectly well now is being changed to suit the balance going to the employer. So what we're talking about here is a situation where a worker works on a public holiday. It's a day they normally work, so they get another day off in lieu. They have to try and reach agreement by the employer, and often that is done. But where that agreement can't be reached, ultimately it is the worker who gets to decide when that day in lieu is taken. Now, that is only fair. This is a day that is replacing a day of great significance that they have worked. Christmas Day, Boxing Day, whatever. A public holiday where most of their family and friends are having time off and spending time together. Person who works, and we had the example of the bus driver, works Christmas Day, doesn't see their family on that day, day in lieu, wants to take a day that they know that their partner and kids are going to be around to share it with them. Under this provision, they will no longer have that choice. It will be up to the employer to determine when they get their day off. Now, that's just mean-spirited apart from anything else, but is unfairly penalising those workers who are working at the times that the employer needs them to be working. Finally, the sick certificate, requiring people to get a medical certificate for illness or injury for no reason. At the moment, if there is any concern about somebody abusing the sick leave provisions, an employer can require that person to get a medical certificate. This just takes away the fact that they have to have some genuine reason for doing so. And I think Keith Locke actually was quite right when he said potentially this is something that can be used to harass people. It is unworkable. We had submitter after submitter saying this was unworkable, will lead to consequences which will be damaging for those who have responsibility, primary caring responsibility for children, because they use their sick leave for domestic leave most frequently, and will be most difficult for those workers who end up going back to work sick and unproductive.